Good afternoon. My name is Ann Billisbach, and I'd like to welcome you to the Nebraska State Historical Society's Brown Bag Lecture Series that we hold here at the museum, or the Nebraska History Museum, every third Thursday of the month. A detailed schedule for these programs is available on our website. You'll also find all of the information about our services and other programs on that website, www.nebraskahistory.org. Before I introduce today's speaker, I want to thank the Nebraska State Historical Society Foundation. Their support, their funding allows us to tape these lectures and then broadcast them on public access television. And so through their auspices, we reach a very large audience, and we're very grateful for that. Today's speaker is John Hamilton from Lincoln, Nebraska. He is a historian, a middle school social studies teacher. He was for 25 years. He's a longtime fan of baseball and a lifelong learner. For those of you who are watching this on television or on video, I'll just tell you that you're missing out on a wonderful collection of memorabilia that John has brought to share with everybody who is here today. Around the room we have kind of a mini exhibit on baseball. So you're missing out on that, but you will be able to hear John's stories and his life lessons in his presentation, Baseball, There's No Place Like Home. So join me in welcoming John Hamilton.
Well, afternoon. As you can see, I'm a little bit of a visual person. I could not operate in four blank walls. So for the benefit of those in the audience, they have a few different things that used to work for me when I was younger and was interested in, or trying to find things interested in, different baseball cards. And if you look at those of you in the audience here, if you look closely, that you may discover there's some Nebraska connections amongst those, and maybe some other Hall of Famers that you might recognize likewise. I'm 53 years old, so I'm old enough to remember when there was day World Series games. They weren't all done at night. And gloves that go back to my dad's era, but I'm not sure that most of us probably have tried to use. My father used to refer to, what are you doing, just trying to catch with one hand? Use two hands. And if you saw some of the gloves that they used in the 30s and 40s, you would well understand. But by way of introduction, as I said, it's called There's No Place Like Home, but it's really kind of life lessons that I've learned in and out of the classroom as a student, as a teacher, and as a former baseball player. Sometimes people will tell you about how they hit the dramatic home run with the bases loaded, or they struck out the side. I will not kid you. My varsity career at Lincoln East consisted of one half of an inning. I was good field, no hit. So I won't go over my experiences in that regards. There's many more capable people probably in this audience very well. So it's just a game, but sometimes it can be confusing. Our language is rich with baseball terminology. We hear about, well, I can't get there. Can I get a rain check on that? They really struck me out on that. You hit a home run of a presentation. And so if you're not familiar with baseball, some of those terms can be a little bit confusing. About 2 years ago, I saw an article in the USA Today newspaper that talked about how business executives were going over throughout the world and trying to teach the terminology of baseball because it was kind of a lost art, and there were some people missing out on some of the implied messages throughout that. So sometimes, as confusing as it as being, the song "Take Me Out to the Ball Game" was over 100 years ago, just a couple of years back. But as the shoe cartoon says, it doesn't make sense. You're already there, and they have you thinking. Amidst this presentation, there'll be a number of people that I'll make mention of. The gentleman here, I'm pictured there on the left. The person to my immediate right was a man by the name of John Vernon. I'll mention a little bit more about him in a few more minutes. But I didn't first meet him until just about 3 years ago, and I was impressed by what few things I knew about him and the more I uncovered. He too is a longtime fan of the game, probably much more accomplished baseball and softball player than I was in my younger days. And the backdrop of that is the National Archives building in College Park, Maryland, but I'll get more to that. An alternate title at one time I almost viewed. It was somewhat humbling to think about how could you encapsulate baseball, rightly so, in 50 minutes or less over a lunch hour. Ken Burns, a very able historian, he calls himself a storyteller, but I would call him a very purposeful historian in that regard. Spent 18 hours, 5 years filming, and then recently did an update. So much like the very famous historian Will and Ariel Durant, one time they wrote a history of the world and they said, only a fool would try to compress 1,000 years into 100 pages. We proceed. So, who am I? Who I'm not? You can kind of get from there. Probably I realized it after the fact. Again, because I was kind of good field, no hit, I saw a fair amount of things from the bench. So, I guess I was an acronym before it happened, DBW, designated bench warmer. But even when you're sitting in the stands or sitting on the bench, awaiting an opportunity to contribute, there are lessons. Skip Lockwood, a former baseball pitcher, said it's a game within a game within a game. And for those of us that grew up listening to it on the radio, going out and playing, it's much different trying you cannot get a gist of a baseball game from just watching the highlights on television. As I talked to one of the cameramen setting up before, the first baseball game was filmed with one camera. Could you imagine back in, I think it was the late 30s, early 40s, the difficulty of that? Just with one camera, by the time that the ball was hit, you got it to where it was focused on, it would be blurry. It was like a tennis match. Thankfully, there's many more cameras to cover the angles, but as someone once said, there's two kinds of baseball fans, those that come to the game time and those that come early to batting practice to see. So I have nothing for sale out at the bookstore afterwards, but I would encourage you to check some things. I'm a perfect testament that sometimes you think you know some things about a sport or a topic, and I had a bit of an aha moment a few years ago when I was back in Cooperstown, New York, doing some research at the Baseball Hall of Fame and Giamatti Research Center, and I open up and I'm pulling out folders about different Nebraskans and such, and I open up a folder for Grover Cleveland Alexander, and I look down and I do kind of a double take. I think I've seen the article once before when I was a student at the university or when I came back in the summertime, but I didn't recognize that it was from Nebraska History Magazine. And the author of that particular article from about 15 or 20 years ago was the assistant director of the Nebraska State Historical Society. And so it was kind of an aha moment. What's wrong with this scenario? I'm halfway across the United States researching, and there's somebody much closer to hometown, in fact, the same town I flew out of a couple days before, that was very well knowledgeable about not only Cardinals and Grover Cleveland Alexander, but a number of other things likewise. So sometimes we overlook what's in our own backyard and we go looking elsewhere. Save yourself some time. Now, I never put baseball cards in the spokes of my bicycle tire, but there were other collectors that did. I met some that said, no, I use playing cards. They were plastic. You got a better wick of sound. But anyway, but they're basically pieces of cardboard. Now, our perspectives change. If you would have asked me when I was about 2.5 when this picture was taken, incidentally, to give you context, I grew up in Lawrence, Kansas, so it was tough moving from Big Blue to Big Red country, but I did that at age 14 when we moved to Lincoln. But right across the street from that is South Park, not the cable show, the large park in Lawrence, Kansas. And so, I grew up having an interest in baseball. Some family members had it. We had the park across the street to play in. And so if you would have asked me what I wanted to be when I grew up or got older, when I was 2.5, I wouldn't have hesitated to say, I would have said, play for the New York Yankees. At the time that I was growing up, Ralph Houck had succeeded Casey Stengel. Casey Stengel they put out to retirement. And of course he goes across town and becomes the manager for the Mets in 1962. But in 1961, the Yankees pull up a really young, unexperienced minor league manager by the name of Ralph Houck, Well, Ralph Houck was born in Lawrence, Kansas. I went to church and school with one of his nieces, and he came back the summer after '61. So, but sometimes we change our perspective. Up in the corner there, that's a picture of yours truly back when I was a junior. The jerseys have changed a little bit since the mid-'70s, thank goodness. But, you know, obviously I was interested in other things in high school. I went on to college, was interested in architecture, advertising, ended up teaching. And if you'd asked me today, you know, what I would do, well, you know, sometimes an idea or a thought can sometimes help us, inspire us to different things. And certainly Mark Twain's philosophy of, I never let my schooling interfere with my own education. For me, that meant baseball. Baseball was kind of the hook that I was curious about learning more and more. And I'm sure if we would bring in teachers from Lawrence, Kansas and Lincoln, they would probably say, that's a guy that always used to say, could I do the science of baseball, the language of baseball? I OD'd on baseball, but it did get me to the library, and I found other books that had nothing to do with baseball, but there were some kind of connections. So sometimes you have to kind of take up your own initiative. So as I said, if you'd asked me that today, you know, baseball, no, that's just kind of a silly childhood dream. I want to play in the Kids in the Cubs League. Down in Florida, I think they still have the league. You had to be 75 or older, okay? Now this goes back at least 30 or 40 years. Now, my wife does not share the same dream with me. She's hoping that I will outlive her so that she doesn't have to see me try to field a ground ball in my 90s. I think the oldest gentleman that ever played in the Kids in the Cubs League was somewhere at about 95, 96. True story. I met a gentleman not that many years ago who just recently turned 95. And he is a testament to this. He didn't start playing in these leagues until after he had retired for many years. And as Bert apologetically said a few years ago, well, now, John, I don't bat. I don't field anymore. I just bat. And I go, Bert, I hope when I'm 90, 92, I can be that much involved in the game. So sometimes our choices change based upon our experiences, based upon where we travel and the things that we do. History is kind of like that sometimes. And some people don't always like history. I didn't always probably like history. I think sometimes it's the way it can be presented and whether you kind of see a connection. The cartoon here, you know, if history is just name, date, facts, spew it back on the test, you know it for the chapter test, it can seem a lot like, you know, who's some old-time famous guy, you know, in one ear and out the other. So sometimes we have to look for our own connections to be able to make it more purposeful. Sometimes other sports, not just baseball, kept me kind of in the game. John Wooden, a longtime coach, he really considered himself a teacher, and I think rightfully so. He mentored a lot of his student athletes, and a great many went on to graduate and be contributing members in a variety of different aspects. They didn't always agree with him philosophically, but they appreciated his sense of commitment and his insight. And I had a few history teachers in high school that reminded me that I didn't quite know everything that I knew. Down at the bottom there, of course, you know, if you go up to the Nebraska State Historical Society up on our street, you'll recognize that a front emblazoned in stone. The gentleman at the center, it's sometimes a small world, grew up in Nebraska. I met him when I was 10 years old. I honestly did not have any connection. I was at a church camp. It was down near Junction City, Kansas. He was a 25-year-old graduate student who probably somebody twisted to go along to help out a bunch of 4th and 6th graders. We found ourselves about 15, 20 years ago down in El Paso, Texas. He teaching at the community college and he'd been there a number of years, and I at a middle school down there teaching 8th graders. And we couldn't quite understand why there were 2 Kansas Jayhawk fans, both living in El Paso, Texas, until I mentioned Camp Washunga one time, and he said, Camp Washunga? What year? 1968. And I looked up the picture. Of course, you know, the 10-year-old had the picture. The 25-year-old graduate student didn't. He came back to Nebraska a few years ago, but before he passed away, and was doing some research. I helped him find the whereabouts of the Historical Society. And of course, the picture off to the side, if you grew up as a Kansas fan, you know that was Texas Western in 1966, and JoJo White's about ready to put up the shot that will be waved off because he brushes the end line. I grew up a Jayhawk fan. I grew up believing that JoJo was fouled, that the shot should have counted, that Texas Western should not have advanced. I've seen footage. JoJo was out of bounds. I can accept it. And the better team won, to be honest, that day. I had a history high school teacher, Mrs. June Williams, definitely a lifelong learner. This was a woman who had not finished college at Drake University, went back after she was 40, got her degree, always had an interest in history, and she taught us history at Lincoln East. We had to make a 100-page notebook on the influence of ancient Greece to modern society. And even when you're a senior in high school, you're thinking, how do you fill 100 pages? I saw her grading her last year over the Christmas break, and I said, why are you spending your Christmas break grading these? First, I had to give her some grief because we had to have them turned in before Thanksgiving. Why did they have until... Anyway, she said, well, John, would you have learned as much from a 100-question multiple choice test? Point taken. After all, age is a question of mind over matter. If you don't mind how you are, it doesn't matter. Now, look, I'm 53. The closer I got to 40, the more I thought, Satchel Paige was a heck of a baseball player and a pretty good philosophical guru as well. They say a picture can be worth 1,000 words. Sometimes in the course of this, you'll see some cartoons and some other quotes. The people down below are all former teachers or colleagues of mine, and I'll get back to a couple of those here in just a minute. But exercise is an important part. The caption says, can Howard Sr. come out and play? It's a lifelong skill. Hopefully, I never learned to switch hit. I couldn't hit a curveball to save my life. But there were some interesting times that I had playing baseball. Most of life is really about roots and wings, providing opportunities and kind of challenging one another to do that. An ancient Greek Chinese proverb said, teachers open the door, but you enter by yourself. You got to get involved on some things. These were all former teachers of mine. The woman at the far right has a baseball connection, although she probably didn't originally intend it. Jan Roberts was my 5th grade teacher in Lawrence, Kansas. We had helped with a class right next door to that had to be severely and mildly handicapped at the time. This was about 1968, the fall of 68 and spring of 69. She had asked for some volunteers to do this, on recess. We weren't going to get paid. We weren't going to get any extra recess time. They happened to be the class that was right next door to us, and between our class and was their class on the way out to the exit. And so she took the initiative to see if there would be some people that would be interested, and I and a number of other people did likewise. We didn't realize that Mrs. Roberts might have been working on her secondary degree, and she became a special ed teacher, but she empowered us with a little bit of opportunity for some understanding and being able to work with a variety of aspects of students. And what we didn't realize was there was a bit of a payback that we were able to garner later on. As I said, I grew up when World Series games were afternoons. They weren't evenings. And so to a baseball fan, I didn't really threaten my mother or father with playing hooky, but there was some possibilities that, it was tempting. And the 1968 World Series was the St. Louis Cardinals versus the Detroit Tigers. Now, I would have been rooting for the Cardinals at the time. I hadn't yet moved up to Lincoln, Nebraska, but I knew who Bob Gibson was. I had heard about him from other relatives up in Nebraska, and Kurt Flood and Orlando Cepeda, Tim McCarver. I'm sure there's a few other Cardinals fans in the room as well. And unbeknownst to the 5th grade class of Mrs. Roberts, we were invited in to watch one of the early World Series games, because the only television set in Lawrence, Kansas at Cordley Elementary School happened to be in the class next door to us. So, gentlemen here, the cartoon may tell it a little bit. Having taught, sometimes you don't always have the most up-to-date materials. Things have improved greatly in my 25 years that I was in the classroom, but sometimes you get an older textbook, an updated one, and you realize that students kind of think, well, history is just history, right? It doesn't change. And I said, well, I could bring in some history textbooks that I grew up with in the 60s and 70s. You might be interested to try to find some people or reference events. I don't think you might find them in there. Why is that? History hasn't changed. Our interpretations has. Maybe our understanding of it a little bit deeper and further questions. So sometimes a geography teacher might be limited with what they could do. The two gentlemen there, one of which happens to be in the audience here, was a colleague of mine out in Holdridge, Nebraska. And Ron Uribe brought geography to a very small metropolis of 5,600 people in Holdridge, Nebraska. much like June Williams, as I had said, in a room with no window, she taught us to see the world. Dick McGowan, it's always a small world. Dick McGowan was another history teacher that I had back at Lincoln East. And what I didn't realize until talking to Ron as we started teaching, Ron had student taught underneath him. And so we both came back and guest lectured in Dick McGowan's class a couple years before he died. So, as I said, the impetus on this was baseball was the hook that kind of kept me in the ball game. Nothing's interesting if you're not interested. I honestly don't remember or know the context of Helen McGinnis and where that was said, but I found that quote one time. To be honest, probably because part of the 100 pages that we had for June Williams' Greco-Roman history notebook could be quotes pertaining to ancient Greeks. Then you had to make some kind of connection. So I was looking through quote books ad nauseum to try to fill in. Of course, you were limited on the number of pages. You still had to do stuff. And you couldn't use National Geographics because that'd be too easy. And woe be unto you if you used a Roman name for a god or a goddess when you're talking Greek. You know, again, I know my architecture. I could tell you an Ionic, Doric, and Corinthian column. That was the additional curriculum. So sometimes it helps to be able to see things from a different perspective. Just a few weeks ago, the end of last month, all the fifth graders in Lincoln Public Schools got the opportunity to go out and see the Salt Dogs play. It was special, I think, for a couple of reasons. And I got to give kudos to the people at LPS and the Salt Dogs president, Charlie Meyer, who kind of initiated this idea a few years back. They moved the game to the morning. Now, for a lot of us, we don't realize the cumbersome that puts upon the athletes. You know, they're traveling, they're having to get up, batting practice, everything early. Everybody's got to get out to the ballpark. I mentioned to a couple of people, there's probably a number of people my generation or older that might enjoy coming out to a morning game, afternoon game. We remember what it was like that rather than the late nights. So if you haven't gotten a chance to see the Salt Dogs play recently, I would commend you to do that. But a quote that I use for June Williams' notebook, nothing in excess. The caption here, of course, says, "Son, are you familiar with the word obsession? Sometimes you can go too far." Okay, so try to balance things out. Harry Truman's put it this way: the only thing new in the world is that you don't know. Sometimes we like to think we know what we know. We don't always know what we don't know. And sometimes history helps us discover that. For instance, I don't know if any of you were ever down at the old Municipal Stadium. At one time it was called Blue Stadium. It's also the same ballpark that the Kansas City Monarchs played. Muehlbach Hotel used to be the owner of that. Well, Harry Truman's on the side. That's the Kansas City A's. They weren't yet in Oakland when that picture was taken. And so I used to go in and watch the Kansas City A's play the New York Yankees or the Cleveland Indians. My dad was an Indians fan. He remembered Bob Feller. So we saw it. And it took me some time to find this photograph, but I had a number of people remind me that there was a contraption when the umpire would run out of balls, the foul balls would be knocked out. Normally you have a ball boy come up and bring in between innings to shuffle them up. There was a contraption behind home plate. It kind of went down into a trap door. And this rabbit would pop up with a basket, and the umpire could replenish. I don't think I've seen this in a Major League stadium since that. Now, Nebraska has its own connections. Grover Cleveland Alexander, as I said, that's where I first came across Andrea Falling's article, halfway across the globe. And Clarence Mitchell was a teammate of his. Again, a small world. I had a Roberts Park Little League coach by the name of Mark Mitchell. First day of practice, he's telling us how he had played at Lincoln East and he had a family connection. And I said, yeah, Clarence Mitchell, the only guy that ever hit into an unassisted triple play in Major League Baseball. And I remember, we called him Mitch. We didn't know his first name. He was probably 6 or 7 years older than we were, and we were about 13. We were soon to be ninth graders, so we thought we knew everything, right? Just came from 8th grade, and he said, who are you? How do you know that? What I didn't know is Mr. Mitchell got up to bat twice. He was a starting pitcher for the Brooklyn Dodgers. That Bill Wamsganis was the second baseman for Cleveland Indians. I used to ask my students, now think about this: how would you possibly make an unassisted triple play? It wouldn't be easy. Runners on first and second. Normally, what positions do you think might be the most natural chance to make it? catcher, he'd be too far away from the runners, right? Shortstop or second baseman usually. And in the case of that last scenario in the 1920 World Series, Bill McGinnis was the second baseman for the Cleveland Indians. Line drive was hit up the middle. He was kind of hedging towards second base, so he catches the ball, the batter's out, steps on second, the runner that's trying to break to third is out, and he turns. And about 4 steps away from him is this runner that broke. It was a hit and run from the call of the play, and just froze in his tracks because he realizes what's about to happen. He gets tagged on assisted triple play. I don't know if you've ever witnessed a game. When I was in Little League, we had a shortstop almost make it an unassisted triple play. After he caught the ball and tagged second, he ran into the dugout. Got to know the situation. We didn't have one out. He thought there was. Other Nebraskans, the connections. Richie. But what I needed to finish was Clarence Mitchell got up to bat twice in that game. He hit into a triple play the first time up. He hit into a double play the second time. I understand from what I read about that he went around almost with a medallion or something, said 2 at bats, 5 outs. Try to beat it. It's tough. Trust me, I would have easily done it. Bob Serve, this was the 1961 New York Yankees. Okay, Ralph Houck was the manager, that new young rookie manager from Lawrence, Kansas. Okay, and Bob Serve was left fielder, left, center, and right, respectively there. Wahoo Sam Crawford. I grew up knowing about Wahoo Sam Crawford. There's a book over there called Glory of Their Times. That was written back in the 60s. And it had an interview with Mr. Crawford. I actually met a good friend that ended up with an autographed ball of Wahoo Sam Crawford. He traded me that for it. He had gone over, tried to enhance the red ink, so Wahoo has both red and blue. When I looked it up some years ago, I said, Dan, this needs to go back to you. You're teaching 5th grade in Nebraska. I'm down in El Paso, Texas, and I had no idea. I traded him some. He liked Green Bay Packers, so we traded some stuff. But I thought, no, this needs to go back to Nebraska at least. So, are there some baseball stories that you have out there that you shared with some people? Some firsthand things. I think that's the purpose of history. If we just look at things in the past and we don't make connections. We don't try to see how there can be some interesting connections to it. It's a matter of sharing the stories. In the late 50s, for instance, there was a Nebraska State League. It was basically kind of a all-rookie league, but they were tied into major league affiliates. The Kearney were tied into the Yankees. Holdridge, where I taught and Ron taught, was the White Sox. Few of the cards that are floating around, if you look on the back, sometimes you can't tell everything from a box score or looking on the back of baseball cards. But sometimes you can find out that they may have played closer to home than you think. All these guys played for the Kearney Yankees, including, and again, an aha moment after the fact, even for an ex-history teacher, when Rudy Storr was my baseball coach in high school, and Rudy played on the 1956 Yankees. When he was posthumously elected into the Nebraska High School Hall of Fame, I Googled up and I recognized Hal Reniff and Jim Bouton. Bouton didn't play, but Darren Johnson and Hal Reniff, and I recognized, those guys winded up. I looked down, the backup catcher for that 56 Yankee team was a guy by the name of Tom Anderson. I taught 2 years, 1984 to 86, at what was then called the Kearney Junior High. Tom Anderson was a PE teacher 2 halls down in the other part of the building. I had no idea until about 2 weeks ago when I finally made the call and confirmed, yeah, same guy. But perhaps one of the most unique stories in Nebraska is that we had the first African-American professional baseball team west of the Mississippi River. There's a book called Only the Ball Was White. It was written by Robert Peterson in about 1970, and that's how I first came to that. I must say it, when I read, I wasn't really into poetry, fiction. It had to be about real stories, about real people, usually baseball players, to start with. And so I kind of skimmed and scanned a little bit. At one time, I thought I had read every book in the Lincoln downtown Bennett Marla Library. But trust me, don't try to make such assumptions. On good authority from the last time I was at Cooperstown to do some research, about 150 to 200 new books every year come out on baseball. So I'm not sure we could keep up, and with my eyesight, I'm not sure. And then there were other times where future Hall of Famers played in Nebraska. Ed Cott The article there on the right side came out just before the 1919 World Series. And if you know a little bit about history, you know that was the World Series that 8 players were accused of purposely losing to the Cincinnati Reds for money. And the scandal really didn't break until the 1920 season. But Ed Cott was the pitcher on that particular team. Well, if you look closely, scan down about the third line from the top, 1907 he played in Lincoln, Nebraska, for the old Western League. Had a pretty fair record. If you notice, he moves up within the next year to Boston, the American League, the Red Sox. A couple years later, he gets traded to the Chicago White Sox. And of course, his last season would become 1920, but when that was appeared in print, it was not yet the World Series beginning. And guess who came to Omaha, Nebraska in mid-late October of 1927? Recognize the guys on either side of Father Flanagan off to the right? Lou Gehrig, Babe Ruth.
Babe Ruth.
Yeah. Bert Boquette, the guy that I was referring to, the 95-year-old that played in what would be similar to the kids in the Cubs League. A few years ago, he told me, I said, well, what's the first game you remember going to see? He said, well, it was the 1926 World Series. St. Louis Cardinals, Grover Cleveland Alexander versus Babe Ruth, Lou Gehrig. I said, boy, that'd kind of spoil you, wouldn't it? You know, after you see that for your first Major League, he had I think, an uncle in St. Louis area, and so he got a chance to see. Some former baseball players are also played in the minors. Bobby Shantz played in Lincoln in 1948. I know because I met a person at a Brown Bag lecture a couple years ago that said she had an autographed ball from Nellie Fox. If she's out there, have her contact me because I've got a card to go along with her. I said, well, do you have a picture, a card to go along with? No, she said 3 friends. We were all 10, and we all got that autograph, and I ended up with the one. And I thought, you know, when you've got a story like that, you need to have a visual to go along to corroborate the thing. Kurt Flood played for Omaha just before he came up to St. Louis. So, life lessons learned, recognized, realized, and demonstrated in baseball. You've got to know the situation. You've got to look for opportunities, contribute to the team, stay in the game, step up to the plate. You've got to take initiative sometimes even when you're not sure that you can get the bat around quickly enough or you even see where it's coming from. I was there, okay? You've got to learn something new that you didn't already know before, okay? My pet peeve or bias was baseball, but I didn't just try to recycle the same report or everything else. Each time I went to the library, I found something else that got me to think something else, to see a different connection. And although I did check out the same book a couple of times, the one on First Commissioner of Baseball, Judge Landis, I looked back one time before we went to computer where you used to have to write out, you know, your name and address on the card to check it out. Some of us remember those days. I looked down, I was the only person that checked out that book for about 5 years. And the other person that had checked it out was a guy that I played with for McDonald's area softball team. So it's a small world, and you got to have fun. So know the situation. See, unfortunately, Casey at the bat, you know, probably the greatest ballad of baseball history. You know, the outlook wasn't brilliant for the Mudville Nine that day. The score stood, anybody remember? 4-2, but with an inning left I won't get the whole thing. My brother and I could have the whole thing memorized, complete with and then finally he whiffed. You know, you got to do the sound effects. You know, now the air is shattered by the force of. When you're young, you know, you got to use imagination. So Casey's wife's going, "How was your day?" Wrong thing to ask, you know, on that. I'm not sure you can quite see it, but John Gallagher was a cartoonist that did a lot of work for Saturday Evening Post. Boy's Life is where I first discovered it. The old sport magazine, and the catcher is not trying the 1, 2, or 3 fingers down. Written on his catcher's chest protector, it just says "think." Sometimes, you know, you have to overstate the obvious. Christie Mathewson said, "You can learn little from victory, you can learn from defeat." Now, there's a tendency to look at that and go, "Oh yeah, sure. The pitcher, he lost the game. He's trying to justify it." You can look him up you can look it up, as Casey used to say. Christie Mathewson was one of the first 5 players inducted into baseball's Hall of Fame in 1936, 3 years before they built the building. Okay, he was one of the ones that was posthumously elected. He had served over in World War I and been exposed to mustard gas, and so he died in the early mid-20s. But he won, I think, 363, 373, 373 suddenly comes to memory. So he's a little familiar with winning and participating. So sometimes they provide different interesting things. But, sometimes statistics in and of themselves can be isolated. You may not be able to figure it out, but, Joe Jackson is the second person from the right there on the photograph on the left. But just to demonstrate that, jump around here for a second. Yes, some people looked up the Britannica Collier's Yearbook, the World Book. There was a baseball encyclopedia. Every player that ever played, even a half of an inning, okay, would be in this book. This was published about 10 years ago. It's available now online for a small fee, of course. But that's his record. And so, as the question says, Joe Jackson batted over 400, and he didn't win the American League Championship. How is that possible? Well, the year was it 1911? I've had too many eye surgeries, but it would be about the next to last column there. BA is batting average, SA is slugging average. Isn't it 408 or 40? Yeah, 1911. My angle-wise here, I'm thinking it's 408. Unfortunately, there was a guy named Ty Cobb that played in the American League at that time, and Cobb batted 420, 422. So what are the odds? You bat over 400, and you don't win the batting title. So, and if you just looked at the numbers, okay, for instance, on that last frame, I won't go back to it, but if you look at the years 1917, 1918, 1919, and 1920, you'd notice that Jackson played in about 140, 50 games for all those seasons except for in 1918, he played in less than about 70 games, I believe. So, well, now why is this? Did he get injured? Have to have surgery? Did he, steroids wasn't a question or issue? Was he holding out for more money? We'd be wrong on both of those accounts. So sometimes a worthwhile field of history is tracking down and finding out. When I went to Cooperstown Baseball Hall of Fame the very first time, I took that picture. My photographic skills weren't the best. So this was 1990, at the time when you opened up the file, you had old baseball magazine. They're now all digitized and photocopied. But as you look through, and of course you notice there's kind of a standard picture. Some of us that remember back in newspapers, you would see kind of a one-column picture of Mickey Mantle or Bob Gibson that would always appear. It would be, your standard publicity still that the pictures would be distributed around. And this was obviously one of them because I saw it in there over a couple of years. Well, the one on the far right tells you that the context of history helps a little bit. 1918, it's World War I. Some players are drafted, go into service voluntarily. Some go to work in war industries, related industries, as did Jackson. So that accounts for why 1918 he didn't have such a. The White Sox had won the World Series in 1917. 1918 they didn't repeat. They could have used him probably. So you got to look for opportunities. Both of these gentlemen did that both on and off the field, quite purposefully and quite remarkably. The quote by Jackie Robinson over there is, I'll have another one I think most of us have heard before, but this one says, life is a spectator sport. If you're I apologize here. If you're going to spend your whole life in the grandstand just watching from your seat, in my opinion, you're wasting your time. You've got to get involved. So, contribute to your team. This is the quote I think most of us remember or might have discovered once upon. And you don't have to know a great deal about Jackie Robinson for that to make sense. Certainly what he did in baseball is remarkable, but the gentleman in the top center there, right next to the guy on the baseball card, is that John Vernon again. And if you Google Jackie Robinson, you're probably going to find some references to John Vernon. He worked in the National Archives as an archivist for well over 20 years, just recently retired about 3 years ago. He helped aid a lot of people to trying to track down documents. He showed me some letters that Jackie Robinson had written to various presidents and leaders across the country as early as the 40s and 50s, trying to get to see some civil rights equality, not on the baseball diamond, but out in everyday life. The article down at the bottom there, Prologue is the in-house magazine of the National Archives, and Vernon has done a great many there. Bob Feller was a favorite player of my dad growing up. If you look back at statistics, you'll see some players suddenly have great seasons and then they're not playing for 2 or 3 years in a row. Well, of course, they all fell between 1942 and 1945. And Feller was never disagreeable or never, bad sour grapes about the fact that he was in the service at the time. He missed out 3 years on his prime. Probably would have had about another good 50, 60 games. So there's a couple things about John Vernon. As I said, a remarkable individual. He had taught American history at then Tuskegee Institute. Now it's Tuskegee University. Small world. He grew up in Iowa. He came back to visit, took the train back last year with his daughter. He'd moved away to Louisiana when he was 7. And they came back. He called me kind of out of the blue, and we had met at Cooperstown, or at National Archives, and doing some research. And he'd shown me around there a little bit. And he was kind enough to say, well, do you want to meet? We're going to be in Iowa just for a couple of days. And of course, we decided that the most natural meeting place in Iowa would be Van Meter, Iowa, where Bob Feller's childhood museum. So I said, can I bring a tag-along guest? And so I'd wanted to get my dad there for a number of years and accomplished that last summer. Some more things about John Vernon. Baseball in the Classroom is a book that is available for a lot of teachers. I hadn't discovered it in my teaching. I kind of created my own along the way. He did an exhibit on using basically a baseball card case, Fleer versus Topps. It was the Federal Trade Commission. Fleer's was suing Topps for monopoly back in the early 60s. Topps only issued their cards with gum. Fleer tried to come out with a cherry chocolate cookie. I've read the accounts of the things. From everyone I've ever met, had to be the worst cherry cookie known on the face of the earth. Nothing against Fleer. They were trying to get in. They won the suit, but sort of lost out in the competition. Down in the bottom left-hand corner, I thought I had a few books on baseball. He had his area pretty well organized, and a testament to the guy. Some of us have collecting of cards or whatnot, and they're basically pieces of cardboard. I have some old ones that are, a little bit better than most, and others not so much. But I don't put a great market value and buy and sell them in great quantities. And some of these starting lineups, little figurines, when I looked over the shelves, I kind of chuckled, because I know some people who keep in a case thing because the resale value will be worth it and you can't take them out. To a small kid, it's a toy. It's something to play with. There's a card that goes along with it. If you want to keep the card, fine. He had Jackie Robinson and Josh Gibson and others sitting out on the counter. That was another reason I like John Vernon. So you got to stay in the game. Honestly, for years when I found this cartoon at the left, I thought that was an umpire that was in the hospital. But it's not. Sometimes you have to have. And the caption on the far right, again, a John Gallagher cartoon, if he could only hit. Sometimes as good as you try to accomplish things, there can always be the naysayers that try to, and that's the great thing about baseball. You don't have to be perfect. If you get on base 3 out of 10 times, you're doing pretty good. I wasn't close, though. You got to step up to the plate. You got to take both initiative and responsibility. Now, the little kid is going back into the sporting goods shop. He wants his money back because it didn't work. Sometimes timing is an important thing. Famous pitcher Sandy Koufax said that hitting is about timing and pitching is about upsetting timing. Take that back. Warren Spahn said that. So you got to learn something new. The person watching the television set there, the game, kind of wanting to be in the position of the umpire from the angles. Of course, there's a lot more camera angles now to work that out. But it helps if you've ever been in that role before. The guy at the bottom right is yours truly. The year after I graduated, or the year after my sophomore year at baseball. And I ended up umpiring Little League games, the kids who were basically a year before. I had played against them the year before. Steve Damkroger went on to play at the University of Nebraska in football, and I never played against him in football. I had to bat against him in baseball, and I didn't get a hit the year before. And I umpired, and unfortunately, he threw a couple balls that most batters couldn't get, and sometimes when the batter would swing, the bottom would drop out, and the catcher wouldn't get it. And I was standing behind the catcher. And Lincoln Parks and Recs, we were making $2 a game in 1974. Enough in my day to these stories. I've met a couple of people that told me what they were making in more recent years. Of course, inflation has gone up a little bit. But we were not issued shin guards. We had a chest protector. So I learned that you might have to, when you make the call, pick up the leg at the same time, shave on your shins. Oh, incidentally, the picture at the left there was Junior Scholastic. Now again, from inside the classroom. My brother got this. It's 1961. Probably won't recognize some teams there. They've moved around. Some no longer exist, and there have been a lot more because there was only about 26 there. So you got to have fun. You know, the Who's on First routine is one of the classic routines, and I'm not sure it's ever been translated. I've seen some parodies of it over the years, but it definitely demonstrates the futility and confusing nature of language. Because basically, of the two gentlemen, Abbott and Costello, Costello is the one that's asking the question, who's on first? And unfortunately, the more information he gets, the more confusing it becomes. So as I put on the caption there, sometimes when you go out to the ballpark, it helps to pick up a program, if for no other reason, to be able to figure out who's playing what. So as much as this presentation has been about baseball and the topic, it's also been about some other things. The real lessons are those. James Baldwin. I didn't know who James Baldwin was when I found that quote. I'm sure I found that quote sometime in 1975, 76 when I was working on that Greek mythology notebook. I knew my mom had mentioned something about him. I read a couple other quotes that I discovered. I knew I couldn't use it for the Greco-Roman history. Finally figured out who James Baldwin was when I was looking through a biography of Wilt Chamberlain. And here's this tall gentleman standing in downtown street in Harlem next to this much shorter African-American gentleman. That was Baldwin. So, but remember, as Althea Gibson, again, cross-reference other sports. It doesn't have to just be baseball. Said, no matter what you accomplish, somebody also always helps you. So remember that picture that I showed you at the beginning? There's the real context. So that's probably why July 1998 was kind of special and for me and the family. Was able to get a number of people that were grew up playing baseball, and aside from the photographer who was still around at the time and helped make sure the trip was possible, I did get her permission to use the stills. She gave me the negatives years ago, so I have no qualms about that. So take the time to explore, investigate history, because there is no place like home. And I know I grew up in Lawrence, so had to try at least one more pun.
Yeah, right.
Those names may not mean as much to you as they do to me. Trust they all had an influence in this presentation. First and foremost, the ones at the top on each side, Jeff Holland works down at the Design Center. He graduated from Lincoln High. He's younger than me. I've got, as I kidded him, I said, I've got pieces of old cardboard older than you. This was my first experience at a PowerPoint presentation with poor eyesight, and the idea of trying to digitize several thousand slides to pick and choose, he helped learn the thing. John Lindahl was the gentleman who called me for a brown bag to schedule in sometime back. And any other? If not, thanks for audience. Feel free to look around and catch any stuff.